Good evening, everyone. My name is Robin Archer and I'm the Director of the Ralph Miliband Program here at the London School of Economics. And I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight to our most distinguished panel on the rise of big technology. Now, as everyone knows, the pandemic has placed new communication technologies at the centre of all of our lives in a way that was not true until recently. And many activities, indeed this very activity we're engaged in tonight, have become largely dependent on it. But what will the long-term consequences be of this type of change? And what will the consequences be of this new, more acute dependence on these kinds of technologies, especially for politics and especially for work? Well, as I say, we have a distinguished panel here tonight, and I'm going to introduce you to them in the order that they're going to speak. So our first speaker will be Professor Helen Margates, who's Professor of Society and the Internet at the University of Oxford, where she was previously the Director of the Oxford Internet Institute until a couple of years ago. And she's now the Director of the Public Policy Program at the Alan Turing Institute. She's published a phenomenal number of articles, I think over 100 articles and books, broadly on the relationship between digital technology and public policy and politics. And she's actively involved in public life in a number of advisory roles for government. She's won all sorts of awards, including recognition most recently from the Political Studies Association, but with its premier prize, the Mackenzie Prize, for her book, Political Turbulence. Well, our second speaker is Chi Onwura. Chi is Labor's Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital, and she's the MP for Newcastle-on-Tyne Central. She has a degree from Imperial College in electrical engineering, and she's worked for various private sector organisations in a number of different countries. Before she became an MP, she was the head of telecoms technology for Ofcom, the regulator, and she entered Parliament in 2010 and has been centrally involved in the development of Labor's policy in these areas for at least the last 5 years. Now, the third panellist is Pilita Clark, who's an associate editor at the Financial Times. She's worked in various capacities at that newspaper, which I think can, in a way, be said to be now, as it may not have always been, the newspaper of record. She was an environmental correspondent and she's worked in other capacities too. And prior to that, she was a senior writer at the Sydney Morning Herald, where, amongst other things, she was their Washington correspondent. She's held fellowships in university organisations, including Harvard. And if you read the Financial Times, you'll know she's a trenchant, insightful and entertaining columnist. And you can find that every Monday on the back page. Well, each of our speakers are going to speak for about 10 minutes, maybe 12. And then we're going to have a chunk of time for questions and discussion. But before we do that, I would normally say, can you join me in welcoming our speakers? But I can't do that, so I will just clap for everybody in welcoming our speakers to the LSE for our panel tonight. Thank you very much. So I'll turn to you first, Helen.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks everybody for coming. So as Robin pointed out, we're supposed to be at the LSE, but we're not, because it's not an ideal world. I did my PhD at the LSE in the 1990s, and I remember possibly even in the lecture theatre we would have been in tonight or this afternoon, listening to one of my supervisors, the great Professor of Public Administration, Christopher Hood, give a lecture on administrative values. And I want to step back to that moment just temporarily and argue that we need to think about values, about administrative values, about organisational values when we think about technology in this crisis. So I'll just start with a flashback. In that lecture, Christopher argued or claimed that there were three sets of administrative values, basically. A set of values around resilience, robustness, stability, the principle of reliability and relying on mechanisms like oversupply to ensure resilience at all costs. Secondly, fairness, honesty and transparency in public office. And thirdly, efficiency based on principles of economy, frugality, leanness of purpose, sort of lean and mean, if you like, about prioritising the cutting of costs. And he argued in that lecture that overemphasis on one of these sets of values can endanger the other two. And you can maybe satisfy two sets of values to some extent, but you can't possibly satisfy all three. And what I want to suggest is that in this crisis, we have seen exposed, the pandemic has exposed an overemphasis on the efficiency set of values at the expense of the other two. And we need some sort of recalibration. So ever since the kind of earliest computer systems in government, I wrote my PhD about those in the 1990s. The focus has been on using technology to automate administration, to replace people, to cut costs, efficiency, economy. In government, in my field from the 1980s, that was reinforced by 25 years of the so-called new public management, focusing on a lean state, outsourcing, disaggregation, breaking up large organizations. And it was further reinforced by a decade of austerity and cuts to public services, which we all remember very well. In the private sector, it manifested just-in-time production techniques, large-scale automation, huge resources pumped into the development of artificial intelligence and robotics, geared at replacing human tasks and humans with robots and driverless cars and so on. So that's the kind of prioritization of efficiency. But the pandemic crisis has exposed in our approach to technology this lack of the other values, particularly resilience. And I think that's manifested itself in two key ways. First of all, the digitization of everyday life. We're living our lives online. We're doing everything online. And where we can, we're working online as well. Now, the basic technology, the kind of nuts and bolts of it have, I don't know what everybody thinks, but I mean, to me, they've held up surprisingly well. I'm quite surprised that so many of us have had surprisingly resilient sort of internet access. But the other point is the kind of what we're doing on it, the digital platforms where we all now spend so much of their lives. This is what has really exposed the lack of organizational resilience in terms of safety, for example. We've seen a huge rise in online harms, an upturn in financial scams, grooming for child abuse, radicalization, what the World Health Organization have called an infodemic of health-related disinformation about the virus, about mad cures for the virus. We've seen a tsunami of hate speech, particularly directed at East Asian people. And these platforms now are critical infrastructure, and we need resilient systems to kind of moderate them, to deal with them. We need resilient systems of content moderation. But actually, at the beginning of the crisis, we found out that's exactly what we didn't have. So at Facebook, for example, it transpired that there were no facilities for content moderators who deal actually with the worst 20% of malicious and abusive content to work from home. They ended up automating various kinds of almost impossible to automate content moderation with fairly disastrous results. YouTube was the same. They conducted fewer human reviews and they openly admitted that it made for poor content takedown decisions. So I just wanted to point out there that this is the sort of forgotten area of living our lives on digital platforms, these things like content moderation. And that's absolutely crucial for resilience. Platforms have to be safe, otherwise it's like creating a state-of-the-art water supply and then filling it with water that is unsafe to drink. There's another way that technologies is affecting the other value that we need to prioritize, which is fairness and transparency, as well as the spiraling inequalities that arise from the pandemic. We're seeing sort of technology inequalities, people who have decent internet access, laptops, skills to use them, those who can work online, and then those who can't and don't have those things. And I think Pilita's going to talk more about that, so I won't go into that. But I do want to make the point that actually lack of fairness and rising inequality kind of reinforces the lack of resilience. Inequalities ultimately bring lack of resilience. Any mathematician looking at complex networks will tell you that. So there is a rational as well as a moral case for a focus on fairness. The other way in which lack of resilience is exposed in our technology during the crisis is in our kind of data science, our ways of doing data science, data flows, data modeling. Those two things should be ways out of the crisis. And of course, in some ways they are. We've seen massive attention directed at epidemiological modeling, and rightly so. Epidemiologists are the new TV rock stars. But there's a kind of problem with using data science to get us out of this crisis in two key ways. First of all is the lack of fine-grained, real-time data flows. We've seen over and over again really important weaknesses in central local data transfers, or the importance of knowing how many people have died in as near as possible to real time. We don't actually have figures on death rates and so on until about 4 weeks after the event. The importance of knowing in real time how many people have the virus through the test and trace systems. All those affect our capacity to use data science to control virus spread. For data-driven modeling, if you don't have that kind of data, it's like using one of those showers that has a time lag on the heat button. If you don't know for a minute or two whether it's turned hot, one of those old-fashioned showers, you turn it up to get more hot and you're liable to get burned. The other point is lack of integrative data science models. We've got a lot of epidemiological modeling, we've got a lot of economic modeling, but we need also integrative models that take account of the health situation, the economic situation, the state of play in education. We hear far, far less about models like that, and we do need them. We need them when we make decisions to close our schools or offices or any of the other measures that are being taken to reduce virus spread or recover the economy. We need them when we do things like calculate exam results, as we found to our cost. So I'd like to finish by suggesting sort of two ways we can overcome these issues with the failure of the kind of lack of emphasis in resilience in the way that we have thought and should think about technology. We need to innovate for resilience, that's what I'm arguing. First of all, research. As I mentioned, a great deal of AI research and development goes into building efficiency through cutting out people, driverless cars, robotics, and so on, automating things that people used to do. That means, if you think about it, developing machines and technologies that can do what people can already do, like walk without falling over, playing board games, those kind of things. They might do it better and quicker, of course, and we do need those things. I'm not trying to deny that. But for organizational resilience, we also need technologies that can do what humans can't do, like bring together multiple sources of large-scale data together to aid decision-making, that integrative modeling I was talking about. That's much less glamorous than building robots, but it's just as difficult and just, I would argue, in this case, sort of as important. We have just launched a program to confront that topic at the Turing Institute. We're calling for 9 postdoctoral researchers, just in case there's any great data scientists in the audience. It's called Shocks and Resilience, and it's about building resilience into policy systems for the future. In contrast to that, in the crisis, innovation budgets across firms have been slashed. That's very worrying. Where there has been innovation in organizations that just can't operate online, it's often been dedicated at replacing humans and cutting them out altogether. A more resilient approach would really involve thinking about our safety infrastructure, for example, making platforms resilient, making organizations so that people can work from home. And the last point there is regulation. Resilience requires regulation. If we want a resilient organizational life, we need to tackle online harms. We need to make our platforms safe places to be and to do business. The platforms are doing more than they used to tackle spiraling disinformation in health, for example, particularly about the virus itself. They're doing more to tackle misinformation in this also important election coming up next week. But it's little and late, and we can't rely on them for that. We must have a multi-layered approach. And as well as new legislation, the long-awaited online harms bill, for example, we need to update existing legislation. Some of these problems are not new. Another issue, the issues about inequalities in the workplace, for example. Take a look at the Institute for the Future of Work report launched today, which explains why we've got to mine this gap in the regulation of data-driven technology and calls for an Accountability for Algorithms Act. So many pieces of legislation, like the Equality Act of 2010, they were just made when we weren't thinking about artificial intelligence or machine learning. So to conclude, we need some kind of recalibration of values that are embedded in how we use, how we develop, how we innovate technology as we go forward, hopefully out of and beyond the current crisis. We need this shift from efficiency to resilience and fairness in values. And finally, it's really about kind of taking back control. To coin a phrase, we tend to think about technology as if, particularly when it comes to work and replacing humans, we tend to think of it like sort of flooding over us as being a sort of tide that we can't do anything about. And I think we're sometimes encouraged to do that by policymakers who talk about kind of mutant algorithms, and as if it wasn't something that anybody had responsibility for or could control. And I think innovating for resilience and prioritizing resilience would be a really good way to sort of take back control over our technological lives. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we just move straight to our second speaker, Onwura MP.
Hi, and thank you very much thanks very much for the introduction, Robin, and thanks very much to the LSE for inviting me to speak here today as a neighbour of David Miliband MP for many years in the north of England, and then as the Shadow Digital Government Minister under Ed Miliband as leader, and now working with Ed Miliband as the Shadow Business Secretary. I'm also in the Shadow Business team. This sort of extends my engagement with the Miliband family in a very prestigious way, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion at the end of it. And thanks very much, Helen, for those opening remarks. And so as Robin and Helen have said, I'm the Shadow Digital Science and Technology Minister, and the coronavirus pandemic, and a chartered engineer. The coronavirus pandemic brings my sort of brief to the forefront of many people's lives, of everyone's lives, really. And the fact that events like today are happening digitally is a testament to that. The pandemic hit our economy generally really hard. I know that as a constituency MP, and we have the figures that support that. GDP shrank from between April and June the UK GDP shrank by a fifth, which was twice the average of the OECD. But the digital economy, or to put it another way, the parts of the economy online that are online and not about day-to-day contact, that was the most resilient. The UK was already a global tech leader before the pandemic. London tech-based companies attracted 3.2 billion of investment in the first half of 2020, which actually outperforms Paris, Stockholm, Berlin, and Tel Aviv put together. That's a lot of investment. And so the UK tech sector went into the crisis in a strong position, and e-commerce has risen by 7 percentage points during this crisis, peaking at 33% of all UK sales, a third of all UK sales in April at the height of the pandemic. But whilst we know that now, or in September, the latest figures, the wider economy is still about 7% behind what it was in the final quarter of 2019. So the pandemic has seen digital become central to all our work and social lives, leisure, everything that we do, our online Zoom cocktails. And the Centre for Aging Better has praised the effect simple services like online grocery shopping have had on the quality of life for the elderly. And the ONS has found a majority of people have felt empowered by the ease by which they can access digital services. And Ofcom found that we have risen significantly the amount that we spend, the time that we spend online, and the greatest rise has been seen within the older generation. But this is I think brought to the fore some of the concerns that Helen was was talking about, and which, you know, as Shadow Digital Minister and also as a professional telecoms engineer who spent 20 years rolling out the networks which are now the internet, you know, I've long argued that government needs to do more to ensure a speedier, but also, and most importantly, a fairer transition to a digital society. And the pandemic has proven to be an unexpected catalyst for that. Now, back in the 90s, it's a long time ago now, but we often talked about how digital would disrupt the world. And at the time, I was a director of strategy for a tech startup, and I had to learn the lovely word disintermediation to describe how the power of the internet would take out all those middlemen, very rarely, occasionally middle women. So reducing costs, liberating value. We wouldn't need travel agents or estate agents or any agency, because we would be our own agents. And the internet did disintermediate. Travel agents, you know, are largely gone. Estate agents are under threat, and news agents make their money out of alcohol sales. But we are not our own agents. Instead, we have new intermediaries, such as Uber, you know, an example of a lean platform that seeks to provide greater returns for investors by squeezing increasingly desperate workers. And as Helen mentioned, you know, lean platforms own very few assets, and they claim to have very few employees. If you're an Uber driver, you don't get sick pay or training or any of the rights you might expect if you work at a company. Though to be, unions are challenging this, thank God, and we have seen some progress. But as an Uber driver, without those rights, you still have to own and maintain your own car and pay for your own petrol. Uber is the world's largest taxi firm, but claims not to own any cars. And you know, that's one reason why they seem to be putting so much investment into the Uber bikes around London specifically. So services such as Deliveroo and Just Eat have reported a surge in business of over 30% more sales compared to 2019. And of the additional 5 billion that has been added to the UK e-commerce market, 2 billion of that has gone to Amazon. Jeff Bezos' personal wealth, so not Amazon's value, but his personal wealth, rose by 75 billion in the time of the pandemic, at a time when many of my constituents have gone from earning decent living to being on universal credit. And so this is one of the reasons why the benefits of the digital, this was one example of the way in which the benefits of the digital transformation have not been shared fairly. So the pandemic thrives on inequality, and it has highlighted the digital inequality. And indeed, some economists argue that digital necessarily drives inequality because of the nature of the assets which are invested in, and because of the incentives which lead to, and I think Helen described, investment being focused on driving people out of jobs, if you like, rather than incentivized to invest in people to do better, more hyper-productively high-skilled jobs with the aid of digital, as opposed to being replaced by digital. So the impact of the pandemic has accelerated digital growth and innovation, fantastic, but it's also created challenges, and inequality is a key one of them. And that isn't just economic inequality. I think the pandemic has also created new divides, but the existing divide is the digital divide, because whilst the vast majority of us use the internet every day, a significant minority, up to 10%, are not internet users, and effectively that inhibits their ability to participate fully in the society, in the economic life of our nation, as well as the social and leisure of our nation. Access to the internet, so it should be a right, not a privilege, and this means providing people with the skills and the confidence, as well as the protections, to engage in our digital economy, as well as the necessary infrastructure, and ensuring that no one is priced out of important digital products and services. But that raises the question, how are people priced in? Online platforms such as Facebook, Google, YouTube, Instagram, they're a central part of our social lives, and they play an increasingly important role in how we access news and information, and indeed misinformation. They also drive how and what we spend our money on, how we contribute to public debate, and how we utilize our spare time. But we have little to zero control over how that content is created by the tech platforms and delivered to us. And that content is curated. Just because there's an absence of regulation, that doesn't mean that there's an absence of curation. It is effectively curated by the platforms. As somebody kind of framed, we thought we were using Google to search the internet. In fact, Google was using the internet to search us. Taking our data, turning it into advertising revenue and behavioral change nudges. But that data is not part of the traditional competitive economics framework. As I know, having worked for Ofcom in terms of the definition of markets, it's the definition of anti-competitive behaviour. It's all about how prices are influenced, but we haven't yet got a way of reflecting the value of our data, and I think we have not yet got a way of giving people ownership and control over data. And that is why it is so important that we get the public policy response right. Now, the question I was asked was something like, what is the long-term impact of COVID-19 on the tech sector? And you may have noticed that I have not answered that question. And that's because, we are the answer to that question. The answer to that question is determined by the public, while a general, but particularly the public policy response. And Labour Party has just finished taking submissions for our consultation into our digital future. Because this government has, in my view, as a passionate technology evangelist, been almost criminally negligent in not conducting any real debate into the nature of our online lives, our digital future, and what are the principles and values which should drive that. So we have seen existing regulations such as it is applied in a sort of ad hoc way to incredible transformative changes in how we live and work. We need a debate which decides, which agrees, I hope, or decides whether it's right that Facebook sort of decides the ethical rules for content, or whether government has a role in that. I believe government does have a role in that. I believe we need a set of digital rights, and companies need a set of digital obligations, and we need a robust regulatory framework which is based on principles, not on technologies because they change, but on principles which can be applied in a forward-looking way. And so the pandemic, it's a huge, it's a catastrophic effect on our economy. It's a catastrophic effect on the lives of so many, but it's also a unique opportunity to challenge the direction of innovation and our economy so that it benefits communities across our country rather than a narrow elite. As much as the government like to think it will, the market isn't going to step in and solve the issues that we face. And we need to solve new and evolving challenges with a principles-based, evidence-based regulation that reflects the needs and capabilities of everyone. And this should be what we mean by building back better. Technology doesn't have to be something that happens to people. Technology should be something that people, and particularly government, determine the long-term impact of. So the pandemic is and will have long-lasting effects on the way in which we work, socialize, consume, communicate, and innovate, and particularly brought together with the fourth industrial revolution. And I haven't even mentioned the Internet of Things, and Helen mentioned AI, etc. But we need to have an intelligent debate about what our digital future should mean, and use this as an opportunity to build that in a way that involves the talents of everyone and supports the productive capability of everyone. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just move straight on to our third speaker, Felita Clark.
Thanks so much, Robin. Let me echo Chi and Helen say how honoured I am to have been invited. It's a great pleasure to be here. So for the past 3 years now, my day job has involved writing, amongst other things, 700 words a week about the most interesting, compelling, significant, or unexpected aspects of working life. And in preparation for this talk, I was looking back at some of the things I'd been writing. It's slightly embarrassing to see what I wrote on February 10 this year. It was a nice little light-hearted look at this odd situation in China, where the world's largest work from home experiment seemed to be getting underway because of what seemed to be at that time a fairly localized outbreak of something called the coronavirus. So little did I realize, and I urge everybody not to go and look up that column again. The only thing I'm pleased about is that at least I did recognize that remote working was something of interest and importance. And as time has gone on, of course, the pandemic has forced employers of all sorts, all shapes and sizes to accept that the shift to remote working is something that needs to happen. And you know, for me, I think it's made this year not just unexpected and unimaginable, but also quite exciting and also at times quite unsettling. And that's partly, but by no means entirely, because of changes in the way that we use technology. And it is, of course, this shift by no means uniform. As we see from research that comes out on a daily basis, the impact of this crisis, as Helen and she have mentioned, has been profoundly uneven for individual workers and for industries alike. And the recovery is on track to be just as unequal. So forgive me in advance for concentrating my remarks on people and sectors that are at least able to work remotely. Obviously, this is not the case for everybody. So let me just first say that when I look back at what's been happening in the working world over the last 7 months or so, since the lockdowns in March, I find myself dividing that period into 4 quite distinct phases. The first one was really panic. The first weeks of the lockdown were marked by huge amounts of confusion, fear, alarm, general uncertainty about how working life was going to continue when large chunks of the workforce had to stay at home. Then there was a second stage of mild shock when we discovered that actually you could keep everything from a bank to a call centre to a newspaper running with everyone working from home. When the FT discovered that you could actually put out a paper with everyone at home, we were pretty shocked. You know, it was not something that we ever thought we would be able to do. In fact, we used to spend a reasonably large sum of money on disaster recovery centres, as a lot of businesses do, just in the event that something terrible happened and we all had to not be able to go into the office, or little did we realise. You know, it's also quite sobering to think of what would have happened if this pandemic had occurred a few years ago when we were all on 3G. There was no such thing as Zoom. You know, it would have been quite a different pandemic for many of us. But, you know, as Helen says, the really interesting thing was nothing broke, really. The internet more or less kept on working. So did the water, so did the electricity. And for many people, working life went on. So then there came this third stage that a colleague of mine calls the Blemonge Period, which is where the excitement of being able to work all day in your tracksuit sort of started to wear off a bit. The realization dawned that you might be now spending months staring at the same backyard, the same street, and for an unknowable period of time. That then ended, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, with this glorious 4th stage of summer abandon, where I think even some of the most law-abiding and cautious of us thought, you know what, if it's good enough for Dominic Cummings, and it's good enough for me, and I'm going off to the beach, the pub, wherever, I'm going to be doing my best to pretend this didn't happen. So it seems that I think we've now entered this quite difficult 5th stage, where we know an enormous amount about what not to do in this new world of pandemic working, but not enough to be certain about what we should be doing next. We know, for example, that some businesses can continue to operate with a largely remote workforce. We know that that can happen exceedingly well in some cases. We don't know how long they can keep it up, nor what impact it will have on staff. And we're not entirely sure about how to manage what seems to be, I think, inevitably a permanent shift to what people are calling this hybrid or mixed workforce, where some people are at home and some people are in the office and most people are doing a mixture of both. And we're certainly not entirely sure about about the role that technology should be playing in all of this. So what I just want to do very briefly is talk about a few of the people and companies that to me have stood out in the last few months either because they've done something clever or unexpected or smart to deal with this uncertainty, or because they've done something idiotic that I hope people never repeat. So just starting first with the smarter ones and focusing on them really. I think the companies that are getting through this fifth stage better than others are the ones that simply, you know, it's very easy to say this now in hindsight, but they were the ones that really many years ago thought quite seriously about practices that a lot of other firms discouraged or ignored, like flexible working. So if you look at a company like Dell Technologies in the US, they've had an extensive work from home policy since 2009. Before the pandemic struck, 30% of their staff were working remotely on any given day. 65% of them were only in the office for a couple of days a week. And so when the lockdown started in March, Dell shifted 90% of its 165,000 employees to fully remote work over the course of one weekend. I'm sure that didn't go incredibly smoothly at all times in all places. And of course, not every company has the capacity or the makeup to actually be able to achieve that. But the reason I mention it is because, you know, as with so much else in this pandemic, it shows that efforts that once seemed wasteful or wrong-headed or expensive have turned out to be anything but. And by the way, Dell claims that flexible working has saved it nearly $40 million since 2014, partly on lower office costs. So you might say, well, you know, a technology company would do that. And obviously, as I say, technology has been central to the way in which we've worked remotely this year, not least with this ubiquitous Zoom call situation we're all in. But it's actually the very human ways that technology is being deployed that I think, for the moment anyway, is really far more important. And so one of the biggest problems with remote working is the difficulty of keeping a large number of people informed and up to date and connected to an organization when almost everyone's working from home. And along with that is a concern that that was raised with me recently, actually, by a senior executive from Mars, the food company, not the planet. And he said that he was not at all worried really about remote working itself. He didn't think it was going to drive down productivity, which obviously some employers think, but he was really worried about how it was going to erode a sense of belonging, especially for younger workers or new recruits to the company with very little history in the organization. So when it comes to actually figuring out what to do about this, I think, you know, we're still at base camp, despite all the Zoom, Slack, Google Meet, Google Hangouts, everything that we've got, which on the one hand is making things much easier. On the other hand, I think it's a mistake to be seduced by the idea that this technology is going to make working life as easy as some people think. So what I think does work, though, for example, is a situation that's happening in the US. I recently spoke to quite a senior member of this large investment management firm based in New York. It does something that I think a lot of organizations should at least be thinking about. It is letting anybody in the firm dial into their investment committee meeting. So that means that anybody in compliance or real estate or legal anywhere can listen in as some of the most senior people in the company present pitches and make some of the most central decisions for the firm. And when he told me this, I was really quite shocked because, you know, this is really quite sensitive, confidential financial data. He said that, of course, confidentiality was crucial, but nothing had leaked so far. He didn't think it would. And more importantly, it was a really good way to let everybody in the company, but particularly young people, see how the place worked and understand, you know, learn firsthand what the business was doing and how it went about it. You know, you could see what was expected of you if you were making a presentation, who's who in the zoo, and so on. And the other reason I think for allowing this sort of transparency to occur is that it makes inevitably employees feel more trusted and responsible and committed to the organization. And as it happens, that this sort of openness is a hallmark of one company that's become even more famous during the pandemic. That's Netflix. And many of you probably know that its co-founder, Reed Hastings, thinks that they're probably the only public company that shares their financial results with staff in the weeks before each financial quarter. So they send this data out to about 700 odd top managers As of this year, it had never leaked. And Mr. Hastings says even if it does, he's got no intention of ever going back, because he just thinks it's this tremendously important symbol of how much the company trusts its employees to act responsibly. So I think that willingness to be more open is going to be needed in this world that is inevitably going to be shifting to this more hybrid working, a way of working. Now, this, as I say, this hybrid way of working seemed to me to be incredibly sensible when I first started thinking about it a few months ago. You know, we've all understood now that we can ditch this 5 days a week, 9 to 5 way of working, the horrible commute. We don't need that. But at the same time, we do need to meet each other in person if at all possible. And there's some forms of work that are just done better and faster in person. So why not have a mixture of it? So it was only after speaking to a Dutchman called Sid Sijbrandij, who is the chief executive and co-founder of what was, until the pandemic, the world's largest remote working company, that I realized the problems with this. So this company is called GitLab. It's a software development company. None of its 1,300 employees work in an office. And Mr. Sijbrandij thinks, for quite plausible reasons, I think, that when conventional companies start to try to introduce this hybrid way of working, they're going to really struggle and a lot will fail. Mostly because they don't know how to do remote working properly. They haven't really thought about it as much as a company like his. So they don't know, for example, that they need to stay at home a lot themselves, the senior leaders, because if they don't, they'll be sending a message that remote workers know all too well, which is if you want to get ahead, you go to the office, you get eye time, seeing time, you get noticed. They also won't really understand the importance of written rules, he thinks, on everything from how you hold meetings to how you communicate. So GitLab has rules on all of this, right down to when you should use Zoom, when you should use Slack, when to use email, when to use Google Docs. And most importantly, he thinks that most leaders haven't thought enough about how much time and effort is needed to use technology to stop staff at home feeling disengaged and adrift. And so GitLab encourages everyone to have these 25-minute coffee chats, one-on-one video chats with people, someone else in the company, doesn't matter where or when, where you basically just talk about anything, and it doesn't have to be anything to do with work. So new recruits are supposed to do at least 10 of these. Frankly, it would drive me mad. It would drive me nuts. It's not something I would really relish, but I can completely understand why, for new recruits in particular, it's a great idea. And so the same goes for a lot of their other rules. So I guess the point is that I think it's true that you need to be very careful and intentional about a lot of the work practices that we've taken for granted in an office setting. So with just an eye on the time, I'll just finally just quickly mention the organisations I think are doing less admirable things that I hope nobody else emulates. The worst by far is the long and quite worrying list of businesses that have allegedly banned their employees from alerting colleagues to a virus outbreak. I say allegedly because this is what is we're starting to see in hundreds of claims that are being filed with bodies like the National Labour Relations Board in the US against some very, very large retailers, airlines, fast food companies. A lot of these companies deny that they're actively trying to punish staff. Some of the small ones actually don't deny it. But the point is, even though, you know, of course, some employees don't want to broadcast their health status, but most very much want and need to know if someone they work with has been infected. So I think, you know, trying to protect a company's reputation at the expense of employee health seems quite foolish to me. So just to conclude, you know, I think COVID will ultimately, at least I hope, be a force for good at work. It's already exposed presenteeism for the wasteful idiocy that it always was. We now know it's possible to be just as productive, if not more so, when working from home, even if we don't know quite how long that's going to last. We've also learned that working life doesn't need to include horrible long commutes and Pret sandwiches at your desk. As for what comes next, I think we know also that pretending to have all the answers at a time like this is pointless. It's almost as pointless probably as pretending the future of work is going to be exactly the same as it is, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Pilita. I'm actually just going to take the chance to ask each of you one short question, and perhaps I should be succinct and maybe encourage you to be succinct too, because we've had quite a few people who want to ask questions. So I'm just going to start with Helen. I mean, you set out a series of developments that have been taking place prior to the pandemic, and you suggested things that ought to be done to change the direction in certain regards with respect to research and regulation. But what I wanted to ask you was whether you think the pandemic is speeding up those changes itself, or whether the underlying processes have really been the same as they were prior to that, and the issues are really similar.
Well, it's a good point about the pandemic forcing us to innovate. I mean, it's like the cartoon, you know, what's the greatest source of innovation in your company? COVID-19, you know. And I mean, I think there is a sense in which it's been a massive shock to some systems, like universities, for example, where I work. You know, we've been talking about moving on and where we are now. You know, we've been talking about moving online for about 20 years, but we didn't really mean to actually sort of do it like completely. And we had to do it in a week. And the same with primary healthcare services, actually, you know, it's astonishing. So it has been a source of new sorts of innovation. And some of the things I talked about, you know, this problem with equality in the workplace, for example, and the way technology treats people unequally, you know, that predates the pandemic, and it's just, you know, getting worse. I mean, it was something we needed to tackle anyway. But I mean, just one last point. I mean, with the kind of forced innovation, I do think, especially thinking about what Chi and Pilita said, I mean, we really, and I hate to be an academic always saying further research needed, but I mean, we really need to be researching this. There's a massive natural experiment there with all these things that have moved online and in a hurry. And there is so much research to do to sort of take what's good out of it and to try and reduce what's bad. And it really worries me that I don't think we're really doing that, and that there are far more people than we might realize here or in the audience that are thinking things will go back to normal. Everybody will go back to the office and so on, and it's so not happening. And it shouldn't happen, as we've all in our different ways been saying. So we really do need to be researching, gathering data and researching that massive sort of natural experiment.
Okay, thanks very much. So Chi, if I can just address you, I mean, you set out a series of problems that have become highlighted and in some ways exacerbated by the crisis, problems of fairness and inequality, amongst others. And you sort of offered, by way of a general approach, the observation that there need to be ethical rules and that government has a role in setting those rules. And what I wanted to ask you was, you know, in the United Nations at the moment, there are debates between different countries about just this question. And the countries that are keenest on government having a role in setting those rules are Russia and China. And I wanted to ask, in that context, I mean, that's obviously not what you yourself are advocating, but what's the significance of that for your observation that government should be playing an increased role in setting those ethical rules?
Actually, I didn't quite say that government should set the ethical rules, but government should set a regulatory framework, and that there should be a debate, a discussion, you know, and where I said that this government had been criminally negligent was in not leading and setting up that discussion and debate about the kind of principles on which a framework should be based. Because obviously, yes, I mean, you're right that I'm not sure. You know, I think in response to our consultation, the Labour consultation on this, we have received, you know, hundreds of responses, you know, most of those from individuals and from citizen organisations calling for greater, or, and I like to say, some regulation of the tech giants, because we do not have a regulatory framework for them right now. So we're in a situation where there isn't one, where the government put out a consultation on an online harms white paper about 2 years ago, got a sort of responses, and still hasn't brought forward any proposals to go to government, to Parliament. So yes, China and Russia, etc., may have are keen to put in place. Well, indeed, have put in place, and we've seen that in China, and the human rights abuses, the Uyghurs, and in Hong Kong have put in place sort of their rules, but actually they are being, which many of our tech companies are actually following, whilst at the same time claiming here that it is for Facebook, with kind of Nick Clegg as their head of public affairs now, to decide what the content is, and that, or Jack on Twitter to decide which of Trump's tweets are appropriate. What I want is a broader public debate about that, where we come to and part of the process of the debate helps us to come to a consensus where not everybody may agree, and certainly there are those who argue very much for that free speech requires that that the internet is a wild west. There are those who argue that the business model of the internet, where it is of the web rather, where it's driven by eyeballs, and combined with artificial intelligence, which can tell the companies not only where your eyeballs are, but how interested you are. That is always going to drive more and more extreme content, and that those algorithms, that is the impact on society is such that it has to be done in the context of some kind of a regulatory framework. And I think that is a response to technological change. And just to finish, I think it's an inevitable response. And I often say to the tech companies, the opposite of regulation isn't no regulation, it's bad regulation. We will get regulation, but it will be a knee-jerk reaction to some headlines rather than the consequence of in a sort of informed public debate leading to a principle-based framework.
Thanks a lot. And just lastly, Felita, I mean, you gave a kind of upbeat interpretation at a sort of basic level. You said it was a force for good, which I thought was a brave statement. I just want you to think about it the other way around a little bit and tell us what your reflections are. So, I mean, of course, it's nice not to have to commute to work, but the reverse side of that is, in a sense, you're always at work, and there's no time where there's non-work. And I wondered if you would reflect a little bit on that. I mean, the office is a way of creating sharp divisions between work and home. Those divisions were not always there. In Victorian times, people often did have to work in their backyard, and manufacturing took place in a small way like that. I mean, are we heading back to that sort of world where actually you never get to stop? It would be a very different future to the one which people predicted a few decades ago of increased time for leisure and less time for work.
Yeah, I hate to think that I've said anything particularly brave. That's very unnerving. But so I guess what I meant by I'm hoping that ultimately, when I say force for good, I mean that we will see an end to the expectation of managers, for example, that unless a person is sitting in front of you or at a desk within eyesight, they're probably not working, which I think is a very human and rather unfortunate way that we've all become used to working. And I think, the pandemic has clearly proven that was, when I use the word idiocy, that's what I think, that's what I was meaning. And I think it's something unnecessary that's been disproved. You're completely right that I think this problem of just never escaping work, and essentially it's not so much that we're working from home, we're living at work is basically what's been happening, and it is a problem. I think it's not been a widely recognized problem. In fact, I wrote about this just recently because it's interesting to see the number of companies, all of them very large companies, by almost all of them quite large, that have started in recognition of this to give their employees days off. So Unilever, for example, discovered that since the pandemic started and since some large share of their workforce started working from home, those people's working weeks that have gone up by about 9%. They also discovered that of something like 90% of them were either working the same or more or longer hours than they were before. So they decided to have this global day of thanks earlier this week. That is by no means the only company to have done that. I think, you know, that's great. It's terrific that they're at least recognizing it, but companies are going to have to do an awful lot more to set the sorts of boundaries that are going to be required to stop what is inevitably, in many cases, I think, just becoming quite difficult, quite damaging and harmful ways of working. And, you know, it goes to some quite dull things that people people have never really wanted to have to tackle it very often in some organizations. It means that managers have to really think about how they're managing. And at the moment, that's very difficult at a time when organizations are under huge stress themselves. Everybody's completely frantic. It's very difficult to have the sorts of one-on-one conversations that are needed to make sure that people aren't burning out. But that's kind of step one, you know, what do we need to do to really stop this sort of problem from becoming much worse?
Thanks very much. I'll just address myself to the audience now. I should have made it clear in the beginning. If you want to ask a question, you should put it into the Q&A, and then we can obviously not put all of them before the panel, but we'll take a selection of them. And I'm going to start with one of those questions now. If you do put a question, it's helpful to say who you are and where you're from. So this is from Iona Turkin, who's a student from Sciences Po in Paris. And she asks, lots of big tech companies have made big profits thanks to the pandemic. We've seen stock prices rise for these companies. Do you think they're in the midst of a tech bubble? I might just use the opportunity to direct these questions to one person in the first instance, so we don't use all the time answering them 3 times. So actually, Pilita, can I direct that to you?
I don't think we are, actually. If I had to bet at the moment, I mean, I wouldn't be racing out to buy shares myself, mostly because I couldn't afford them because they're all so unbelievable. But I don't think so, because I can't, you know, I completely agree with what Chi was mentioning in terms of the regulation that is required. I struggle still to see how that's going to come about anytime soon. And I think what's going to really prick the tech bubble is going to be regulation that, you know, I mean, we'll see it happen in Europe, I would imagine, depending on the outcome of the election, of course, next week before the US. But at the moment, you know, what's been done has not been enough to, has not significantly changed the share prices of these giants and their market value, which is just, you know, just reached unimaginable heights. So I don't like to sound pessimistic about this, but, you know, I think it's been quite striking to me. I don't know how many people here have seen the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which, you know, it took me a while to sort of get around to watch it, but I've been really struck by how many people around the world, just anecdotally, have been not just watching this, but have been really struck by the message that it sends. It's quite tendentious. It doesn't go to any lengths to be particularly fair and balanced, but for those of you who have seen it, you know, it's basically just spelling out the problems that that she was just talking about, and the hunger that there is, I think, on the part of consumers for some form of regulation. You know, it's putting into on the screen, it's reflecting what I think is quite a widespread concern about these platforms. You know, eventually that will be tackled. I just don't see that it's going to be happening anytime soon.
Okay, thanks. I'll move on to a second question from Isla. And perhaps I'll direct this to you, Chi. Do you think that the rise of Android technologies will mean more surveillance and less rights in terms of consent and data protection?
Okay, so I'm not clear what's meant by Android technologies. Is this technologies on the Android platform, or kind of like automation technologies and artificial intelligence? But in terms of do I think that will make, sorry,
I think you'll have to just interpret it how you think, because we don't have the question to ask the interpretation of. But the question just said, do you think the rise of Android technologies will mean more surveillance and less rights?
Well, I
in
think
terms of
the
data protection.
so to go back to the kind of theme of that technology is something that we can determine what happens to us. I mean, yes, without effective regulation. I mean, the point that I made about watching where your eyes are on screen, so you can tell how interested I am in this webinar, for example. That kind of surveillance, combine that with facial recognition technology, which has many problems with it, including not recognizing Black people often, or confusing them with the background because of the way in which the biased. And I think that's another issue that we haven't talked about, is to remember that most of this technology is developed by a narrow demographic of privileged men. And that reflects, their lack of experience and their world. And so it will not be, we do not have technology that reflects the needs or even the presence, of people of color, for example, and the example, or in particular, and of women as well. So do I think it will lead? I think it can do, and I think particularly this is why I talk about Android technologies. I mean, the Internet of Things means that your home, your work, it's just a huge data generator. You think you have a big data trail now with all the cookies you're accepting or whatever, but believe me, when you have a fully smart home, it knows what time your child goes to bed, how much water you put inside your kettle, whether you have one drink or two at the end of an evening, so yes, if that data is only protected by the GDPR sort of existing protections, then that will lead to both surveillance capitalism and the opportunity for governments, to use and access that as well. So again, that brings me back to, with the right regulatory framework, this can be empowering in terms of individual citizens understanding their own data trails, their own opportunities, and being able to use that in a more productive way. So the choice is there, basically.
Thanks. So, Helen, Bindu asks, when we can't even get track and trace right in multiple countries, how can we say we're at the cutting edge of a big data revolution?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and that's at the heart of the point, one of the points I was trying to make, which is that those kind of not very glamorous things are the things that I think we really have to pay attention to going forward. We're beginning to learn that we really need some basic kind of processes of information transfer, both from government to citizens to firms to employees and so on. Pilita was talking a bit about that in the workplace context. Governments need to know what's happening about the virus in order to make decent decisions and decent policy. And some of the most basic data flows are not there. So that is a tremendous problem. And it also, I think, highlights, it's not just about the technology, that's the point. All the focus at the beginning of the discussion of contact tracing focused on this app, that was supposed to sort of solve all the problems. And of course, it never could have been. In fact, the contact tracing systems that are working best are at local level and based on local organizational structures and a sort of organizational resilience of the kind that I was talking about. We've just got to pay more attention to those kind of qualities in our organizational processes, even though it's not very exciting and it's really not. I think we do have this huge tendency as a kind of society and commentators on society to sort of be attracted towards the idea of sort of superhuman technology as superhuman intelligence, without thinking about how it can do things which are actually these quite boring things which are actually really important, and which humans can not be very good at. So it's a really good question. I don't think we we shouldn't be able to in a way, and we do really need to kind of refocus a bit on what we try and use technology for, I think.
Thanks. So next question is from Jim. Perhaps if people say where they're from, it's just nice for the rest of the audience. Pilita, I think it's directed, I'm going to direct it to you anyway. Jim asks, do you think that presenteeism is really dead? Or will employees begin to slip back to the office to be seen to be working when bonus or promotion time comes round? How else can employees display their productivity remotely?
Yes, well, I think Jim's definitely onto something there. That almost certainly, if you work in a company where bonuses are handed out and you're lucky enough to be in the pool of people that can access them or are going to get rewarded with one potentially, yes. People are going to do that. This is not a particularly new problem, really. Academics who have looked at how remote working works understand very well that although workers themselves are often much happier to be working at home, they tend not to be promoted as quickly as people who are in the office. We've seen this come up in research repeatedly, actually. So when it comes to finding out or figuring out a strategy for being noticed when you're at home, that's going to be very interesting to see, particularly as people are now taking advantage of this situation to move out of city centres away from away from their main offices. They're renting and in some cases buying places further out in the country, so they're not right in the middle of the city again. Now, I think it's going to be quite interesting when offices, or assuming offices do start to reopen again, to see how many people feel as though they've got to come in more often, or will come up with strategies like, I do suspect that a lot of people are, for example, attending meetings online on Zoom, and making contributions, perhaps just on occasion, not looking at anyone in particular, if anyone's watching from work, where it doesn't necessarily need to be particularly necessary, but it's a way of showing that you're there, alert, engaged, and possibly ready not to be sacked quite yet, rather than a promotion, I would think, for a lot of people.
Okay. So, Chi, here's a question that the questioner, Gabi Santos, who's an LSE student, directs to you. And it's related to your remarks about knee-jerk reactions from the government. And Gabi Santos writes, it seems tech developments continue to outpace public debates. How do we keep up or get ahead of the tech advancements when very few people understand the developments? And how do we keep such debates inclusive? So at a broader level, you're there in the political machine. You hope to be in charge of these things. How can the political machine get ahead of the technological changes?
I think that's a really interesting question, and having, you mentioned I was head of telecoms technology at Ofcom, which is a regulator of communications technology. And I suppose I've got two answers to that in a way. I mean, first is that, this isn't actually rocket science. It is not, in fact, what we're talking about are the sociological implications of technology that has actually been around often for decades, and which started in labs, whatever, and is being researched and commercialized, etc. And amazing, great innovations in terms of sort of how it's used and how it's applied. So whilst you cannot predict the future, you can look at existing technologies and look at what kind of implications they will have, and we did that in Ofcom, and that's what a forward-looking regulatory framework is about. But I think you're absolutely right to say that it does require people with expertise in both the technologies, existing technologies, and I think that right now, of course, the tech market means that those people tend to be very highly paid. But interestingly enough, a lot of people are motivated by making the world a better place, and and you know, given the right, and this is what, so we're discussing what kind of regulatory body should oversee any online or web regulator, and it needs to be able to attract the best people, and that needs to be about you know, not only, you know, the terms and conditions, but the mission and the you know, of the mission of the organization, which will be really to make a difference to the understanding and the way in which technology is used, and to make it so that it empowers, you know, everyone. But then I think at the same time, we do also need to increase general level of digital skills, and yes, the level of digital skills in Parliament, you know, amongst MPs, and also in our civil service, because there can be a tendency to that still, you know, for specialists to be looked down upon in the civil service, and we need to you know, in value those people who can bring an understanding of technology to an understanding of society and public policy. So it's about bringing those together. So it's not easy, but it is possible. It is certainly possible and doable. And the alternative, which is to leave our future in the hands of a narrow, you know, set of people, is my view not acceptable.
Can I just ask you to build on that with a very specific point? I mean, the United States Department of Justice has just launched an action against one of these companies, and it's basically on anti-competitive, antitrust grounds, which you mentioned earlier. Is that something that Labor would be interested in? Is that something that resonates with the British situation at all, or is that something that Britain is now really too small to have an influence over?
No, I think so. There's two things here. I mean, I think, in fact, Helen put it very well. She said that, you know, that the web has to be safe for people to be online. So there's online harms regulation and a sort of regulatory framework about that. But there is also very important sort of re-looking and giving the political will to our existing Competition and Markets Authority to look at the, as I sort of mentioned, it sort of, you know, like the markets in data, and which aren't being effectively regulated. And just one, you know, specific example: when when Granger Market in Newcastle Central, fantastic market, went online en masse because of COVID, because nobody was walking through, there was no footfall in the centre of town anymore. What determined the footfall to those shops was no longer the layout of the city, or you know, that it was Google and Facebook, because they control the advertising market. And that's something that our Competition and Markets Authority has been looking at. And that was not fair. You know, that was not supportive of competition. So absolutely, Labour would want to see, you know, an more effective competitive market. And then we can have new innovative startups coming in and helping to reduce the existing, because what part of the concern is that the existing giants use their power to buy up other companies and to put in place higher and higher barriers to new entrants. And we would certainly look to address that. Thanks.
So now there's a question from Deepak Kumar from the Punjab University in India, and it's addressed to you, Helen. It says, could you explain your idea of resilience in digital society further? Are you implying resurrecting an element of agency in a society which seems to have been diluted by digital platforms?
Well, yes, I think I am, in a way. I mean, that's why I was talking about sort of taking back control. But really, the idea of resilience comes from, I mean, resilience has been a value in the past. I mean, it has been a value, for example, after previous crises. A lot of our sort of most famous institutions, you know, you could argue the welfare state, the National Health Service, United Nations, perhaps. I mean, you know, after previous crises, the kind of dominant values perhaps were resilience and also equality, because with crises and shocks and pandemics and wars and so on and depressions, you always get sort of spiraling inequality. So the two sort of go hand in hand. And I was trying to make that point, you know, if you've got very large inequality, it challenges resilience. It makes a country less stable. So it is a question of sort of replacing, in a way, something that I think we've lost over the past 50 years. It just hasn't been a value that it hasn't been something that has valued resilience. We've kind of operated in a kind of just in time, going further than supply chains, although that is an issue here, but going to a whole way of thinking that you can do things sort of just in time. So in that sense, I suppose it is a rather sort of old-fashioned idea. But the other point I was making was that you can use technology to build in resilience. In previous crises like the Great Depression or whatever, I mean, resilience came with buildings and people and, you know, stuff. And I'm saying that having resilient data flows and new ways of sort of innovative ways of modeling data and doing data science and building machine learning technologies could be ways to sort of embed resilience in our organizational processes, in our and in digital platforms, particularly the digital platforms of the public sector, and the whole decision-making process, really, how we make decisions. I don't know, if you think about the Ofcom debacle, you know, students couldn't do exams, so we had to have a way of, well, yes, they probably could have done exams, but anyway, they didn't do exams, and there had to be a way of using, of calculating, of assessing grades without having the kind of normal mechanisms to do that. And actually data science was used to do that, but it wasn't very good data science. You know, it was kind of used in an inadequate sort of way. It didn't use all the kinds of data it could have used, and it wasn't used with a good understanding. Coming back to Chi's point, you know, part of resilience would be the kind of skills you need, the kind of capacity you need, that regulators need, for example, to be able to do good regulation in a digital society. They need kind of a new sort of regulatory capacity, which involves understanding what companies are doing and what they could be expected to do, what could be asked of them in terms of content moderation. So it's all about that point of kind of capacity, really, and being able to do things in a digital context that you used to do in an offline context.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, no, someone's just put in the chat that it's obviously the schools issue was Ofqual, not Ofcom, since we have
oh gosh, sorry.
party free about Ofcom. But
I know that very well.
that's a minor point.
We're talking about
can I just stick with you for a minute with the next question, Helen? The Sahar, I'm not sure where Sahar's from. He writes, well, they write there from LSHTM. And the question is, I think a suggested solution can start from fixing the taxation system and even the option of democratization of big tech companies. How plausible is it to address these problems in this way, taxation and democratization? So these are very general questions, but perhaps you could reflect on that.
Well, actually, there was a really good point that Pilita was making about transparency of organizations. And I think one of the massive issues with the tech companies is the lack of transparency. And of course, transparency goes against their kind of profit motive and competitiveness in all sorts of ways. But I mean, I do think that there's something there in being able to demand some kind of possibly through regulation, but some kind of understanding of what they're doing, how they're moderating content. I think it's a very murky world, that, and we're very closed off from it. And these are vital kind of, this is where our democracy takes place. Almost all our democratic life now takes place on these platforms as ordinary citizens. And yeah, we should be able to demand much more in terms of transparency. Some of it can come from regulation, but I think there's a lot to do with actually kind of working with companies rather than this. The current situation is that you get a massive scandal It's like the point about bad regulation. You only get any change when there's some massive scandal like Cambridge Analytica or something like that, and it becomes possible. And somehow we've got to find a way of civil society working with the platforms to tackle that issue, I think. Otherwise, yeah, it is a threat to democratization.
Okay, thanks very much. I possibly got time for just a couple more questions. There's one here from David Lynn from South London. Will the pandemic reinforce the digital divide between the Russia-China camp of control and state-sponsored and the largely Western world of democracy and freedom? And what would the consequences of that be? I'm not sure who to direct that to. The questioner asks for all speakers to address it, but I think that would take us to the end of our period. So it's your go, Pilita, so I'm going to ask you to address it if you could comment.
Good. The least qualified, always the best one to go to. Well, you know, reinforcing the digital divide. At the moment, it's quite difficult to see that that's happening. If you look, for example, at what's happening in China with the Uyghurs, it's very difficult to see that the pandemic has had a huge impact on the way that technology is used there in quite contentious ways. I hesitate to, I'm struggling to think of a way in which one would imagine that Russia's use of various forms of technology to pursue its aims in other countries has been tempered in any way by the pandemic. I don't see that at all. I tell you what I do think is really interesting though, and we've just seen this emerging just in the last couple of days or weeks, really in the US, and that is a situation where the traditional gatekeepers, and I'm talking my own book here a bit, because when it comes to the news media, that's what papers like the Financial Times are, that to some extent, I think a few years ago, we couldn't imagine a time where we were really going to, well, we could see that other sites, news sites that were coming up, and the whole tsunami of social media discussion and debate was something that it was really difficult for us to almost sort of plant a flag and act as any sort of bulwark against. Just in the last week or so, just seeing how the traditional media's treatment of critical stories about Joe Biden and his son and allegations that have been made with little foundation, seeing the way in which they've been resisted by the mainstream media and other forms of social media, I think have not really been able to overcome that, has been really very interesting. You know, I wouldn't have predicted that. You know, apologies for people who haven't got a clue what I'm talking about, but essentially some people who were trying to persuade reporters at the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere to run a story suggesting that Joe Biden had profited from his son's activities. It basically didn't work. And so, you know, it's been really interesting to see that form of kind of backlash in a way happen. You know, whether it's just a blip and won't really amount to anything very meaningful, I don't know. But you know, as with so much else that's happening at the moment, you know, it's something that you kind of watch and hope will last, and without any real expectation that it will. Okay,
thanks a lot. Look, it's a short question here, and I'll direct it in the first instance to Chi. Amy writes, how can we create a regulatory framework that does not dampen creativity and innovation?
Well, that's a great question, and I would say that one of the things that we, when I was working at Ofcom, one of the great challenges and also the great concerns was to ensure that that regulation didn't damage creativity and innovation. But I would also say, actually, it's a short question. We could have a quite a long answer. I'd also say it's always one of the things that Facebook and the big tech companies say, regulation will damage creativity and innovation, as if it will damage it more than the big tech companies buying up all the small creative ones do. I mean, what we need to do, what the framework needs to do is promote innovation and creativity by allowing a more equal playing field for smaller, more, because, to be honest, smaller, more creative companies to grow. And also, I think really fundamentally in two further ways. Firstly, right, if we can have some kind of clarity about, who owns and can, control and offer data, then that can, Helen spoke really, well about the way in which data flows can be a sort of, can be a way of really improving services, improving people's lives. But right now, there's great data concentration in the hands of 2 or 3 big companies, and you could argue government, and a lot of lack of clarity about who owns it and what people can do with it. So by clarifying that would support much more innovation and creativity. And then also by as well as the right regulatory framework, it needs to go with ensuring consumers are much better informed about digital rights and digital skills, and that would also be a way of supporting creativity and innovation. And just finally, I think one of the greatest threats in creativity and innovation in tech is the lack of trust people have in it now. People, and that is, speaking as an engineer personally, I find that really soul destroying. So by having a robust regulatory framework, it increases people's trust in technology. It also ensures that there can be new entrants, smaller companies can compete on a level playing field, a better playing field. And I think that really does promote, the creativity and innovation and the full potential of technology, which I'm afraid now we are losing much of that.
Thanks very much. Well, I think this might have to be the last question. I'll direct it to you, Helen. Anne Angeli from Paris writes, in Europe, healthcare is viewed as a human right. Given this health crisis, how do you view the rise of big tech in healthcare? So this is not a small question either, but it has some connection to what you were saying about data and digital.
Yeah, so the question is, healthcare is a right.
Given the healthcare crisis, how do you view the rise of big technology in healthcare? And it's framed in the context of the idea that healthcare is a right.
Right, well, yeah, technology has got a lot to offer healthcare, but sorry to repeat things that I and others have said, it needs to be within a safe, ethical and regulatory framework. There's huge possibility for, and I'm sure at various level machine learning technologies, for example, were used in right in the middle of the crisis to allocate resources and so on, and sort of learn about the disease, and so they should be. But it comes back to the things that all 3 of us have been saying, I think, about transparency and ethical frameworks for using large quantities of data to kind of allocate resources. It comes to transparency and trust and ethical frameworks, and of course regulation. So I'm a huge optimist about the power of technology to make life better and to make health better in all kinds of ways, but it has to take place within that kind of framework, otherwise it's disturbing.
Listen, thank you very much. Thank you all. We've heard today from Professor Margates about how there are different values that need to be pursued, and that the contemporary pursuit of technological change has sort of overemphasized efficiency and underemphasized resilience. And I think in that context, it's interesting to note that the Labor Party is putting a lot of weight on this word resilience more generally in its policy reviews. We've heard from Onwurah MP that new intermediaries have sort of inserted themselves into the relationship between people and their activities. and that these have given rise to some anti-competitive practices and other inequalities which require a new framework of ethical rules. And we've heard from Pilita Clark, who's suggested that the pandemic has in some ways produced largely permanent outcomes or significant outcomes that will stay with us, and in many ways outcomes that have positive potential despite some of the drawbacks. And I think that last point sort of really captures something about the panel as a whole, who, to my ears, have a largely optimistic analysis of the situation we're in, which I think, whatever the merits or dismerits of it, serves an important psychological purpose in cheering us up in this point in time. So thank you very much. It's an excellent panel we've had and an excellent discussion, and I'm very pleased that you've been able to join us, and to all of our audience as well. Thank you very much, and see you next time.